How's everybody doing? Jacob, thanks so much for joining me today. Folks, I'm here with Jacob Horne. Jacob, please introduce yourself. Tell people what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Jacob Horne. I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist at Summit 7. We are a managed service provider, managed security service provider that specifically works with defense contractors to help them with their cybersecurity compliance requirements. That's DFARS, NIST, CMMC, all the acronyms that are haunting people these days. Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist is purely a made up title, primarily because I don't have a sales quota. I'm not here to sell anything to anybody. My entire job is just to translate the regulatory gobbledygook into normal human language, which is surprisingly hard, as a lot of people have probably found out recently.
Yeah, so basically, your goal is to make cybersecurity sexy.
I mean, that's one way to put it. That's not exactly the first impression people get when they look at me, but but if you find simplicity to be attractive, then sure, we could maybe head towards that idea. Let us know in chat.
Yeah,
That's the first impression you had looking at my face.
there you go. You never know. Manufacturing industry. So let's go down this path. Um, Seems like there's been a lot of talk about CMMC compliance. What is this? Who needs to worry about it? And what is the where does the like hype and a lot of noise cross over into the reality? And is there a line that you can draw for people? Like
Yeah,
how do we make it practical
sure.
for folks?
Yeah. So the best way to think about CMMC is that it is a verification program for the cyber requirements that come in your contracts by virtue of being a defense contractor. So the Department of Defense has had cybersecurity requirements in contract terms since 2013. The current terms have been unchanged since 2016. But the fatal flaw in that system was that there was no proof that anybody was actually doing them. They put the requirements in there, and by virtue of the fact that you accepted the terms of the contract, that was enough attestation to say, we're doing them, which, as you can imagine, it doesn't really provide a lot of assurance that anything's being done. Now, the government never really asked for proof. Industry never really worried about providing proof. And one thing led to another, and multiple DoD programs and weapon systems were compromised directly as a result of contractors' unclassified systems being exploited in ways that could have been at least mitigated by these contractual requirements.
So let's
So,
pause right there for 1 second. So this period of time that you're talking about, is that registering for ITAR and DDTC? That's that, like, I am ITAR registered and I'm set up on the SAM website with a cage code, right? That was about the extent of that self-certification.
yeah, and specifically in this case, for the specific DFARS contract clause, it goes by the number 252-204-7012. Just strictly by accepting that contract clause and signing off, you are attesting to the government. You are making an official statement to the government that we are complying with that contract clause. So it's your
Whether
ITAR registration, it's all that stuff, but it's also everything contained in that contract clause.
whether you understand what all of that stuff means or not.
Hey, we were both Navy guys. How many people did we know who signed a contract without reading it? I was told I was going to get my own jet, and now I'm out here with a needle gun knocking rust off the side of the boat.
Yeah, I didn't know wooden ships existed when I signed my contract, so, I think we both got a little bit of a surprise there.
Yeah,
It's so what's the penalty for violating or breaking or breaching that contract clause?
sure. So just by itself, we're not even talking about CMMC yet, right? We're just talking
Yeah, no,
about
no,
you.
yeah,
Yeah, you
stick with
have
the
this contract in your clause, or you have this clause in your contract. What happens if you don't do it? Well, the most immediate thing that can happen is that if an incident occurs and the DoD finds out, or if the DoD shows up to audit you, which they currently can with a very limited number of auditors that they have under the Defense Contract Management Agency, Their boilerplate response is standard contractual remedies will apply. This could be negative notes on your annual CPARS review. This could be penalties, fines, loss of contracts, loss of option years. There's all kinds of things that they can do in order to have a negative review or impose some sort of penalty on you. Outside of the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice stood up a program in 2021 called the Cyber Civil Fraud Initiative. So, by virtue of you accepting the terms of a contract with the government and then getting paid underneath that contract, you are making claims to the government that you are doing those things. And when you don't do those things, in this case, the government can pursue you for up to 3 times the value of the contract under what's called the False Claims Act. And there have been numerous False Claims Act settlements over the years. They are increasing rapidly. We've heard through the grapevine there are over 100 of them in the queue. And these go after companies of all sizes. These can go after individuals. It's very common in the healthcare sector for Medicare fraud and things like that. But they view noncompliance with DFARS 7012 as straight up contract fraud. And there are companies, even small companies, manufacturing companies, that have been fined millions of dollars for non-compliance with this contract clause. So the
And
penalties can be significant.
so in addition to the penalty, am I allowed to do government work again if I'm convicted of fraud?
Well, typically that's a problem between you and the government. I would say that it's probably a strong discriminating factor. I wouldn't want to have it. I wouldn't want to be wrestling with it if it were me. So
Well,
outside of yeah.
let's pull this thread a little bit further for a second. So this clause shows up in a contract.
Mhm.
That contract is between the government and, let's say, large player like Lockheed Martin or Boeing Defense Systems or Northrop Grumman. Okay,
Mhm.
great. Now, Northrop Grumman, they turn around and they're like, we're going to go buy parts
Yep.
from all of these tier ones.
Yep.
Where will that flow down show up?
Yeah.
And
So
is it mandatory that they flow that down?
So it's mandatory if you are receiving the pertinent data types that the requirements in that clause are designed to protect. So if you are receiving what's known as controlled technical information, which if you are a defense manufacturer, you are almost certainly receiving controlled technical information. If
That's
they're going to
CUI.
yeah, so it's one of the categories of CUI.
Yeah.
CUI is just an umbrella term for any type of unclassified data that is regulated in any way. And there's as you can imagine, there's lots and lots of those. The whole CUI program was created because agencies had created thousands of authorities over all kinds of different unclassified data, and they were called different things, and they had different requirements, and they had no requirements. So really all the CUI program did was just create an umbrella term for all of them. The one that really affects defense contractors and defense manufacturers specifically is controlled technical information. So the types of schematics, blueprints, specs, things like that, that's all going to fall under what's known as controlled technical information. If you are going to have that data sent to you, or if you're going to generate it for your customer, then your upstream prime needs to flow the protections with that data. And so, if you are going to receive that information to manufacture a part, I mean, this goes all the way down the supply chain, all the way down to processing houses. If you're going to have this specific type of data flow through these different companies, that contract clause is supposed to flow with it, and by accepting that contract clause, this could be even in just orders based work. You are telling your upstream customer, we are doing these things. If you read the clause, there's all kind of language in there besides just, oh, we have to do cyber requirements. It's like if we experience a breach, we have to notify them within 72 hours. If we notify them of a breach, we have to make our systems available if the Department of Defense decides to show up and look around and see what happens. There's a bunch of things in there that don't really get talked about in the CMMC conversation that your prime will flow down to you essentially.
So let's take this another step further. So now let's say I'm that tier one and I choose to not follow the rules. So I commit the fraud. I say, okay, I'm meeting all of DFARS clause requirements. And it turns out I'm not doing that. does that then make it so that that OEM is now in violation of their contract with the government? Or does the
Uh,
government just come after me directly?
yeah, so the primes are liable for their subcontractors' noncompliance with the contract terms, which is why, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure you could find some. It's why we've seen so many surveys go out in the lead up to CMMC that only ask questions up until a point where the primes are able to CYA, right? Where they go, hey, you're good, right? And you're planning on getting CMMC, right? And everybody goes, yep, we're good. We're planning on getting it. And they go, okay, we're not going to ask any other detailed information, because if they ask a question and they find out that their suppliers aren't doing what they said they were doing, then it's their problem. And that was they're not in the business of making your problem their problem. And so these surveys are very convenient in the sense that they get to tell their government customer, everybody down here told us they were good. So we're doing our part. And they never actually ask the other questions, which, as people are probably finding out or hearing about now, is a big problem. Let's say you're the tier one and you don't do any of the cyber requirements. Your prime never really bothers to investigate, and you just go about your business. Department of Justice never finds out. You don't experience a cyber incident. You're just doing your thing. This is the case for most of the DIB, right? The problem is when CMMC verification becomes a condition of new awards and you haven't been doing those requirements, you won't be able to achieve the verification. And so you're only doing yourself a disservice. That's why CMMC verification exists, is to plug that gap in the existing requirements. There is no proof that anything has been getting done, which is why they created this program to wrap around it, right?
So how does that work? So now I say, okay, look, I'm doing the right thing. I want to do the right thing.
Yep.
I want to make sure that I get verified. So it's not just a self attestation. I have someone else that signs the piece of paper saying I did what I was supposed to do. What does that look like? What does that cost? How long does
Yeah.
it take?
Yeah, so if you're fully implemented, fully compliant with DFARS 7012, and you know your customer is going to require you to have third-party verification, or you want to get ahead and have it done, then you have to find what's known as a C3PAO, which is a certified CMMC third-party assessment organization. You can find these on what's known as the Cyber AB, the website. They're the accrediting body over the ecosystem. They've got a whole registry of approved C3PAOs that are authorized to conduct assessments. They have a whole long process they got to go through in order to do that. You call them up, hopefully vet them accordingly and make sure that they're interpreting things the way that you would interpret them. It's the same way that you'd go find an ISO auditor for your 9001 or 27001 or anything like that. And then, you pay them for your assessment. You run through the assessment, and then if you're fully implemented and everything is good, then you'll end up getting your third-party certification at the end. Those assessments are pretty straightforward. They run through 4 phases, sort of a pre-assessment phase, the actual conducting of the assessment, the C3PO wrapping everything up, and then you going in and signing off on their findings and everything like that. Now, I say it's pretty straightforward because this is all assuming you've fully implemented everything. What we're finding is that in that first phase of an assessment, it's really a readiness check. It's really like, do you pass the sniff test? Like, hey, a system security plan is the core document that describes your control environment. Sort of like your QMS plan essentially would describe how you're running things. If you sign up for an assessment with a C3PAO and they go, do you have a system security plan? And you say no, you can't run the assessment. And so we've coined the phrase false start because that doesn't count as an assessment failure. The assessment just doesn't begin. And so anecdotally, this is not an officially tracked metric by the government. Anecdotally, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 50% of companies that are calling up C3PAOs for a CMMC assessment can't qualify to start the assessment because even though they've told the government and maybe their prime customer, we're good, we're ready to go, they start to sit down for this readiness check and they're not ready. Like they actually don't have the implementation, to your point, where maybe they didn't understand what they were agreeing to or what they said they had done. And this is becoming a real problem because you're hearing a lot of people say, oh, there's this huge backlog in order to schedule assessments. Well, there was a huge backlog because a lot of people signed up and got on the schedule for assessments. And now those backlogs are actually decreasing because the assessments aren't started. They're basically being like, you come back later when you're ready. And so it actually is kind of a crazy phenomenon that's happening out there. Most companies overestimate their readiness.
Yep.
This has been documented in analysis by the DoD, and MXD is a big manufacturing organization that the DoD has that interfaces with defense manufacturers. They put out a report maybe a year or two ago, and their main finding was talking to companies that have DFARS 7012. They know CMMC is coming. They know their customer requirement. Their main takeaway was people consistently overestimate their level of implementation. They overestimate their readiness.
Wow. So now we have this false start
Yeah.
because we didn't have our system security plan, our SSP in place. So now what? Now I've got to go hire a consultant to build one, or how does that work?
Well, most companies probably don't have the internal resources in order to do this type of work, right? You probably don't have an internal IT department. You probably don't have a security team. You probably don't have the internal know-how. So you're going to have to probably outsource this work. Whenever I'm talking at quality conferences or to manufacturing groups, the way that I encourage people in the manufacturing space to think about cybersecurity is as a kind of new special process, right? This is a this is an expensive, highly specialized type of work that it doesn't really make business sense for you to do it internally, right? Because it's not core to what you do as a business. It'd be like if you were machining parts, but you're not, doing a special type of coating or annealing or heat treating. It'd be very expensive for you to pull that inside. It's the same thing with
Core
cybersecurity.
business. Yeah,
Yeah,
sticking to your core.
it's even if you could find the people who could do this work for you, you probably can't afford them. And if you could afford them, they're going to discover by the time they walk your company through this process that they could go start their own Summit 7 one day because they have a very specialized set of skills and they can scale it across multiple customers, right? So if you think about it as this type of new special process, I've seen manufacturers have a lot of success with that because you're not the one that's going to be putting your hands on the keyboard and doing the work. You're managing this interface with the third party. So it's almost always cheaper to outsource it, just like other special processes. You're almost certainly not going to have the internal know-how to do it. And even if you did, it's probably not worth the time cost trade-off like it would be if you just use a third party.
And that third party process go beginning to end, are we talking a year?
So on average, what we've seen for a lot of companies, even smaller companies, is it generally takes them somewhere between 9 to 18 months.
Okay.
Now, the that's to go from the status quo to I'm ready for an assessment. I can get through phase one and go through. Now, that's not a technology constraint, right? So typically the reason why that takes so long is budget, approvals, who owns this problem. You're talking about taking a company through not just like a digital transformation, but a cloud transformation in a lot of ways. There's a lot of, people label it as compliance, but there's a lot of stuff you have to prove that you're doing, right? So there's just a lot of ways that are going to change the way people work, maybe the systems that they access or things like that. And that takes planning, it takes time, it takes decisions, it takes leadership buy-in. And so people take vacation, and then there's holidays, and then there's budgets, and then there's a foot off the gas, and somebody leaves, and pretty soon it's been 6 months. So on average, we see people take around 9 to 18 months. If you're really committed and you're like, hey, we have a clear signal from the customer, we know what's going on. It doesn't have to take that long, but I would, in my experience, that's what we've seen just with the way that the organizational debts sort of slow the process down.
So a lot of people talk about this as like a tax on their business. Like they have to go through this and do this. But listening to you talk about it, it kind of just sounds like good hygiene. And there's probably a lot of secondary and tertiary benefits that come from executing a more digital transformation.
Oh,
are you seeing those concentric circles pop up where a company that you're
oh yeah.
working with says, "Oh my gosh, now we have all of this data in one place and everyone can access it in a more secure way and we don't make as many mistakes." Like, what are you hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of the, if you ask the Department of Justice and some people at the DoD, they're just going to talk about it from a fraud perspective, right? But
Of course.
actually implementing these things typically motivates the business to work in more efficient ways because they're doing technology upgrades, they're doing refreshes, they're deciding, do we need all these users to move over here? Like, what's actually going on? And so you start to kick over a lot of different rocks, which is a lot of what I was saying. Sort of, there's a lot of organizational debts where they're like, do all these users need all these licenses? Maybe only a handful need licenses, and they end up spending less on the licensing than they were before, even though they're doing this overall project. So it's pretty situational, but for the most part, I would say that CMC gets blamed for a lot of things, but CMC is also uh, particularly helpful at getting companies to ask themselves questions that they haven't asked in a while, and that can lead to a lot of improvements.
It's one of the things that we saw when we started paperless parts is we said, look, the defense industrial base is fragmented, tens of thousands of critical manufacturers doing their work in a very analog way. And we felt like that was a huge opportunity for us to come in and bring in systems that help them work in a much more automated fashion. I think what this is almost a forcing function for the
Yeah.
evolution of the digital architecture that we use.
Yeah, it's absolutely a forcing function. And it's one of those things where, this kind of gets to the core of the problem, right? Is that um the level of risk that the average company is willing to take with the government's data is much, much larger than the amount of risk that the government is willing to take with the government's problem. And they relied on a system where they basically took industry's word for it for many years, and that gap in acceptable risk is what led to this forcing function that we call CMMC. I mean, that's just the way that it works, right? Is that business is about taking risk, you get rewarded. It's a risk reward equation, right? Like all the people listening to this who are running businesses are doing well because they took risks. The problem occurs is when you take risks with data that isn't yours,
Yeah.
and that's what leads to these sorts of forcing functions. But when you dig under the hood, even if you're not a security person, it's like you can't even access your bank account on your phone without getting prompted for two-factor authentication. Like it doesn't matter who you are these days. Like my grandmother has to use two-factor authentication in order to look at her bank account. She probably has to use two-factor authentication to go to the bingo hall. And so when you look at the requirements, a lot of these requirements are evergreen, vanilla, fundamental cybersecurity that's been the same for 30 years. It's like least privilege, two-factor authentication, all of these fundamental ideas, they've been the same all along. And it's really kind of an interesting story because when the government was coming up with the requirements and when they were opting to not have third-party assessments, they said, well, any rational, self-interested business would already be doing these things because who wouldn't have two-factor authentication, right? Like who would let more users than are necessary accessing their data? They wouldn't let them do that for their financial information. They wouldn't let they do that for their HR information or their customer database. But then when it comes to regulated government data, people took their eye off the ball, and that's what led us to this place that we're in now.
Yeah. It's I'm I'm personally glad it's happening, as frustrating it is for some customers and how they feel like it's a painful tax, just knowing that we're not as secure as we think we are is scary. I mean, we did a survey a few years back and 1,000 shops responded, and 50% of them had been fallen victim to malware
Yep.
in the last 24 months. Yeah.
And manufacturers specifically are at a very interesting crossroads, defense manufacturers specifically, because manufacturers are particularly sensitive to ransomware type of attacks from cyber criminals because any kind of downtime is very expensive for you, which means your likelihood of paying ransoms are very high, even if you're small, probably especially if you're small.
Yeah.
However, if you're also a defense manufacturer, you're going to get it from the other direction because you're dealing with the types of data that advanced actors are interested in exfiltrating. And they don't have to go toe to toe with Lockheed's 24 by 7 security operations center and their massive security budget. If they're flowing the same data down to you and you have nothing, then they can just take it from you. They don't have to bother blowing down the brick house. They can
Yeah.
just blow down the straw house, right? And so you have to worry about cybercrime as a very real threat. And you also have to worry about these other significant threats. The irony is that those same fundamental controls mitigate both types of activity. So sometimes this comes up where people hear the DoD and they go, China's after you and the boogeyman is coming. And they're like, well, how am I supposed to go toe to toe with nation state level actors? And the thing that the DoD isn't very good at explaining is it's sort of like planting like a Liberty Garden or like buying war bonds, where it's like little things actually do a lot to mitigate even very advanced actors. That's a more detailed conversation that
Yeah.
DoD doesn't get into, and you wouldn't know off the top of your head if you weren't in security, but it is absolutely true. Two-factor authentication works. Least privilege works. Basic access control absolutely works. And from the government's perspective, this comes up a lot. Their big primary goal is to help defense contractors and the defense industrial base deal with these intrusions. They can't help you deal with the intrusions if they don't know that it happened. And if you don't report it to them, they don't know that it happened. And if you don't have system monitoring implemented, you can't detect that something happened. And if you don't have the other
Amen to that.
precursor controls set up, nothing will be flagged in the system monitoring. And so, if you want the government to come help with these types of issues, you have to do these fundamentals, and around we go, right?
Yeah. So I I know how much Paperless Parts has invested in meeting, and I think I'll just say right out of the gate, uh, there's this term FedRAMP,
Hmm.
and I don't know, I tend to see logos. It's almost like you go to the logo store on Google and you just copy as many logos that mean security as possible and slap them on your website.
Yeah.
So, I have seen machine shops have CMMC logos, FedRAMP logos, NIST logos, ITAR logos, a little Amazon GovCloud logo, all
Yeah.
strung across the bottom. What's the reality there? Like, what does
Yeah.
it actually mean?
I mean, it's the same. I can go buy a black belt on Amazon, and then if I show up to a jujitsu gym, I'm going to get choked unconscious immediately, right? It's like I can put whatever logo on my website that I want to. Uh, luckily for FedRAMP, which is really just another type of program that verifies that things are implemented, right? It's a much larger set of requirements. They're related to the requirements that are verified by CMMC in a longer, interesting conversation. DM me on LinkedIn if you want to hear the history of how those things evolved. But FedRAMP is a program that verifies that requirements are implemented. CMMC is a program that verifies if requirements are implemented. FedRAMP has a marketplace of companies that have been verified to have implemented them. So if you find the company on the FedRAMP marketplace, then you know that they went through this audit process and they have them implemented, not just a logo on their website. Similarly, with CMMC, everyone who will go through a third party assessment will have a certificate that says that we went through this assessment. The problem is that that database isn't public. A database is only accessible to the government. And so people can put CMMC on their website, but there is no place for anybody out here to go and find if that's actually true or not, unless they show you their audit certificate.
So you see a software company that has CMMC NIST 800-171 compliant on their website. Is that what do you make of that?
I would make of that the same thing that the government makes of self-attestation. It's like I have no assurance that that's actually a true claim at all. If you say NIST 800-171 compliant, it means nothing. Like it's maybe Maybe you do, maybe you don't. How do I know? I would have to ask you a lot of detailed questions to find out, and that takes a lot of time, which is why there's this third-party system set up for
And is
people.
that even and I have a limited
Mhm.
understanding here compared to what you're working with, but my understanding is that NIST 800-171 is not even for software companies. It's
That's
actually
right. That's right, yeah. So, as far as this regulated data is concerned, this CUI data, if you're going to be handling that CUI data in your organization, the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 are what apply. If you're going to put that information in the cloud, you have a different set of requirements. You have the requirements that are verified by FedRAMP. And the reason that that's true is because when the government uses cloud services, they can only use FedRAMP authorized services. When you use the government's data in cloud services, you have to use things that are FedRAMP. Now, this is a I'm going to use the bad word, the equivalent to FedRAMP discussion, which is a whole saga in and of itself, but it makes sense. If the government can't put the data in there, without it being FedRAMP, they can't just give you the data and have you go put it wherever you want to, right? Doesn't make any sense. Fun fact, the reason that that became a thing is when OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, was hacked by the Chinese back in 2015, one of the big discoveries was this specific issue was you had unclassified information. It was background checks and clearance investigations and things like that. So this is sensitive data, but it's not necessarily classified, was being put into cloud services that had no protections around it. And so that's why these requirements were revised in 2016, miraculously, right after the bad thing happened, to say if you're going to put controlled unclassified information in as a contractor in the cloud, it also has to have all of these requirements that come with
so
it.
so if you were going to choose a software company to work with that was hosting your government data that you've now signed up to meet the DFARS requirements to secure that data. What questions are you asking? What are you trying to do to make sure that you're
Yeah.
not working with a software provider that just has a logo slapped on their website?
Yeah. Are you FedRAMP? Are you on the FedRAMP marketplace? This is a very fun question that people should ask when they're talking about their ERP solution, because you're taking a lot of controlled data that is ostensibly has these requirements for it, and you're putting it into a cloud service. And a
Yep.
lot of cloud ERP providers have no idea what FedRAMP is. It's not even on their roadmap. And so when you look at there's only 13 paragraphs in DFARS 7012, and when you look in the middle, it says you, the contractor, put our government data into the cloud. You are going to make sure that it is FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. And if you go ask that software provider, are you on the FedRAMP marketplace? They say no. And you go, are you equivalent to FedRAMP? And they go, what is that? Immediate red flag, because you are making the decision with the government's data to put it somewhere that it is not allowed to be. So just because they're the lowest price or whatever, that's not the government's problem. Yeah, it's your problem.
And do you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, you have to have a contract with the government to get on the FedRAMP marketplace. Is that right?
So typically, the way that it's worked in the past is that in order to get your FedRAMP authorization, and just to be clear, for most defense manufacturers, you don't have to get FedRAMP. This is something that your software solutions
Yep.
have to get, right? Typically, the way that it's worked in the past is that a government agency or program office has to sponsor this software solution to go through the FedRAMP process. As you can imagine, that would leave a very small number of things actually in FedRAMP because it's only what the government needs to use. And so people who want to work with the government need to have a sponsor in order to get the approval to go work with the government. And so if they
So
don't know
catch
you,
22, huh?
yeah, exactly. And so this is why it took a long time for FedRAMP to scale and have all these additional services. That whole process is getting overhauled. They've got new leadership in there. They're rethinking the program. It's going faster. It's definitely improving. It's automating a lot. But we're still talking about the government here. So typically, right, if you're going to have a FedRAMP solution, it has to be sponsored by the government. This is where the idea of equivalence came in because
Yeah.
after the OPM hack and we revised this clause in 2016, they said, oh my God, contractors are putting this controlled data in the cloud, but contractors don't have access to FedRAMP authorized solutions. Back in 2016, there were like a couple dozen. And if you call up those companies, you probably can't even get a hold of their federal sales team because they're not going to give you access. Like, so what is the government supposed to do? They're either going to say you can't put our data in the cloud at all, which isn't an answer, or you just put it wherever you want to without any controls, and that's not an answer. So the least bad answer they came up with was, okay, fine. If you're going to put our data in the cloud and you can't get access to FedRAMP, at least make it equivalent to the set of requirements that are verified by FedRAMP. Can we all do that? That's a very reasonable thing to do, except DFARS 7012 has no verification. So everybody's signing on their contracts and saying, yep, we're doing that. Yep, we're doing that. Yep, we're doing that. We're just shoving controlled data into the cloud, into commercial enclaves, into ERPs for years and years and years. The government wakes up after a bunch of bad stuff happens again and they go, what do you mean you're putting our data somewhere that's not equivalent to FedRAMP? We need a program that will come in and verify that you're doing what you said you did. And now we've got a big problem on our hands because your company is now committed to a cloud ERP that has no plans to get FedRAMP. They might not even be able to get FedRAMP. I mean, I'm sure you guys have explained your journey towards FedRAMP as well. I remember years ago when we first met, you
Oh,
guys were
yeah.
like, we have to do this, right? Like, we're not going to start on this process unless we absolutely have to do this. And I remember the whiteboard sessions where it's like, yeah, man, that's just the nature of the game. But I'm sure you see it all the time where, people are using ERPs or whatever, and there's no there's no equivalence at all. They're never worried about the controls or the requirements that are going in there. We see this a lot. CMMC has done more to expose to companies that they are putting ITAR and export controlled information in random commercial cloud solutions than any kind of ITAR problem that they have
Yeah.
encountered in the past. I mean, probably the number one thing that we talk about on phone calls is people who find out that they can't use commercial cloud solutions with their export controlled information, and they've built a business around it. So now in order to get CMMC, which isn't even related, they have to migrate their data from one cloud to another. And then they've got to figure out the licensing, which then causes them to say, well, the licensing is more expensive. So do we need all these users? And like I said, pretty soon it's been 6 months because CMMC didn't take 6 months, but you've got all of these other problems that get exposed by the program.
And so if you're working with a software company that says they are FedRAMP equivalent, what are you looking for from them? Like,
Yeah.
what could they hand you that you would say, "Okay, you guys have done what you should have done
Yeah, so
until the."
the DoD put out guidance in January, where they explained what equivalent meant, and it's basically a whole checklist of information that these software companies have to submit or have a record of that says we're equivalent to the FedRAMP moderate baseline. Uh, in order to do that, they will have had to have engaged with a FedRAMP 3 PAO, which is what they call it. CMMC is a C3 PAO. FedRAMP's a 3 PAO.
Lots of Star Wars terms.
They're not very original when it comes
Yeah.
to the naming, right? They will have had to engage with those companies and essentially gone through that FedRAMP audit and assessment process, short of ponying up the money to run through the red tape on the government side. So they should be more than able to show you a FedRAMP ready certificate, the proof that they went through the assessment, anything that they would have given to the DoD to attest to being equivalent, they should be able to provide to you. If they just show you a logo and they like jingle their keys to distract you, just be skeptical about what's going on because it's on you to make sure um, that you're putting the data where it's allowed to be.
I was just about to ask that because it all comes back to who's liable.
Correct. Yeah, and it's basically that's in the language in DFARS 7012, that contract clause that we talked about originally.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you're hearing or you're seeing out there that might be CMMC washing or just things that are gonna create noise where there doesn't need to be?
Yeah, I think what happens is obviously from November 10th onward,
Yep.
CMC is now able to be put in contracts. And there's a lot, I think, of misunderstanding about how soon that will occur for someone's individual situation, right? So at a Pentagon level, at a very high level, CMMC is now starting to roll out. But when it will show up for you specifically, between you and your customer, can vary quite a bit. Now, obviously, if you were to go to us or anybody else who's trying to sell you a service, consulting, IT, or whatever, we're going to want you to start as soon as possible. And at this point, you're probably behind schedule, but there is an easy way to tell. And it's based off of your customer's long range acquisition forecast. Now, the government shutdown had delayed this. We should have already had the FY26 long range acquisition forecast, but the industry days, the Navy Gold Coast events of the world. These are basically just all of the military components and commands getting up on stage and walking through a spreadsheet that says, these are the solicitations that we plan on putting out over the next year. This is when we plan to issue the solicitation. This is when we plan to award the contract. That period of time between solicitation and award is known as your procurement administrative lead time, or your PALT time. And you can go on the DoD Office of Small Business website, and they've got all the different acquisition commands, and you can go find the spreadsheets that they talk about at the industry days. A lot of those spreadsheets will tell you what the PALT window is. We think it's going to be 3 months between solicitation and award, 6 months, 45 days. That is the key metric that people need to pay attention to, because CMMC status is a condition of award. So a lot of times what I'm seeing is when people try to ignore the noise or ignore the hype, they go, I'm going to wait until I see a CMMC requirement in a solicitation to get started. And that's when I know it'll be real. That's a big trap, because if your customer's PALT window is 90 days and you haven't done anything to get ready for your assessment, no implementation, no 2FA, no nothing, it's going to take you longer than 90 days, right? Like, very, very rarely is the average company going to go from zero to certified in 90 days. If your PALT window is 45 days, you have an even bigger problem. And it's been a big effort on the department's, strategy. I mean, the Secretary of Defense just gave a big speech about this. They want that PALT window to be as short as possible. They want acquisitions to go as fast as possible. So if you know that you're a defense manufacturer and you know that your customer is giving you this kind of data and you know that DFARS 7012 is going to be involved, then you already know that you're going to have to do CMMC level 2, and you necessarily have to start before you see the solicitation on getting these things implemented, so that you have enough time to achieve that status by the time the contract gets awarded. There's going to be a lot of companies out there that wait till the solicitation, they sign up for an assessment, they get a false start, they don't achieve the status, they don't get awarded the contract. And a lot of the companies out there can't afford to miss a contract or award or whatever it happens to be. So, what I recommend is that you find out what your customer's PALT window is and work backwards, and then go to the consultants and the service providers and say, I need to do CMMC in 9 months. I need to do CMMC in 18 months. I need to do it in 3 months. And then you have a way of dictating the conversation, rather than it being like our sales cycle determining like when you can fit in the schedule. Because if you come to us and you say, I need to be ready in 4 weeks, I'll be like, listen, man, our backlog is 7 weeks long. Like, we can't even kick off the project. You're going to have to talk to somebody else. I think that's the most efficient, least hype way of navigating what's going on, is your specific customer's PALT window for the solicitations you know will have these requirements.
And to bring this full circle for folks, even if you're not going after a contract that has CMMC requirements in it, correct me if this is an incorrect statement, but even if you are not going after those contracts and you are working on other contracts that have DFARS 7012 requirements, there is a good chance that if you have not gone through your CMMC compliance process assessment, that you are violating the DFARS 7012 unknowingly.
Yeah, the irony here, right, is when people say, I'm going to wait for the CMMC requirement to get started on DFARS 7012 compliance, you are the reason that CMMC became a thing, is that a lot of people are saying, I won't do DFARS 7012 until I get a requirement to prove that I'm doing DFARS 7012. And that's a rational thing to say, but it is also the fundamental reason why the program was created. It's because for a lot of people, well, unless there's a threat of an external assessment and a consequence of not winning a contract, it's worth the risk. And
Yeah.
to the government, it's not, which is how we ended up here.
And to sum it up, there's a big stick that may not come out that often, but when it does, it comes out in force. And on the other end, there's a carrot for those who choose to move more quickly and capture the new CMMC requirements that are in contracts.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean the
Like,
fundamental way to think about it, right, is that the longer we go into this rollout of CMMC, the harder it is to do business with you, the more you avoid it,
yeah,
right? The sooner you get it, the easier it is to do business with you. You're taking pressure off the contracting officer, you're taking pressure off the purchaser, you're just making it easier to do business with, and that's always a good thing to do whenever you're trying to do business, whether you believe in the reasons behind CMMC or not.
yeah. And at the end of the day, this is just good hygiene.
Right.
So there's very little reason to not pursue good hygiene for your
Yeah,
business.
you're never gonna convince the government that the fundamental requirements in DFAR 7012 are a bridge too far. It just won't happen. They haven't even changed the requirements in almost 10 years. So when people come back and they say the requirements are too intense, they're gonna be like, no, they're not. So yeah, I mean that's just not a winnable debate. And so when you're trying to think of your strategy, there's an old business phrase that strategy is playing the game that you can win, and you're just not going to win the game of convincing the government that the requirements are too burdensome at this
Yeah,
point. And so I think that the best way to strategize, like I said, is find out when your customer is going to issue the solicitation and when they're going to award the contract. Work backwards and have that be your implementation timeline. Don't wait for the solicitation to get started. That's not me telling you because I want you to sign up with us faster. That's me telling you that 90 days isn't enough time. And a lot of PALT windows are shorter than that.
yeah. Jacob, this has been awesome. I can't thank you enough for your time and what you're doing for the industry. Um, I think people are gonna get a lot out of this. So thank you. Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.